who wants to ask the first question? Yes, John Chia.
Yeah, Richard. I think right now everyone care about the status quo, right?
Yes.
And then you talk about, what will be the future for Taiwan. And the Dr. Tsai said the status quo, actually, in Taiwan, no one really know what the status quo is before. And my understanding, the status quo original from the United States. And if Tsai insists the status quo from the United States, which means that the three joint communiques and the Taiwan Relation Act. And since last November, and Ma shake hands with the Xi Jinping, to me, my understanding is that the KMT and CCP all merged to one China. So the one China is done deal. So now all the status quo should focus to the Taiwan Relation Act. And I believe that most people, like the young generation in Taiwan, even their parents or their grandparents from mainland China in 1949, but now they all believe they are Taiwanese. So my question to you is that if Tsai announced the status quo, follow U.S. status quo, do you think that will cause any problem?
Well, this is a very interesting question. Thank you. The United States formulation that we oppose either side changing the status quo actually goes back to 1996, statement that then Secretary of State Warren Christopher made. And the problem here is that each of the three sides, well, let's say Taiwan and the mainland have different definitions of what the status quo is, and each of these is self-serving. Even within Taiwan, the blue camp has one definition of the status quo, and the green camp has another definition of the status quo. We really don't say what we mean when we say status quo. You can infer different things about it, and I tend to just fall back on our abiding interest in peace and stability, but that's a very vague concept, and it can be ensured in a number of different ways. So what will be more important, I think, is how Beijing assesses what Tsai Ing-wen's intentions are, whether it's willing to give her the benefit of the doubt, whether it is able and willing to explore some sort of mutual accommodation and perhaps come to a working understanding of what the status quo is, or will we have a and also there's the question of will Tsai sort of see the importance and the value of her accommodating to China in some way that is not contradictory towards the wishes and expectations of her political base. So it's complicated. Larry.
Just follow right up. What could she do to accommodate or show a kind of conciliatory posture, since she's now backed herself into a corner where she really, I don't think, politically could simply say, oh yes, I recognize the 1992 consensus. Is the alternative language that she's kind of gravitated toward, you think, adequate? What other initiatives could she take? And what steps should she refrain from taking, either substantively or symbolically, that you think she might take that would be very destabilizing?
Okay. Do we have any journalists here? Any journalists? Okay. This part is off the record. Okay. And I'll tell you when I go back on the record.
How would you? I guess there are two questions. One is, how would you expect Beijing or Xi Jinping to react if President-elect Tsai Ing-wen does what you suggested before as a conciliatory measure, and how do you think they should react? Is the
Okay.
question.
We're back off the record.
Indeed, the previous anti-secession law, and the last year's China issued the ID to Taiwan people. Most of
The what?
last year, China issued ID instead of voucher.
Yeah.
Well, most of them change the status. I believe it's like changing status quo because they already forced Taiwan people to accept they belong to China. But does U.S. deem those two actions as changing the status quo? If she does, what does U.S. react to this?
Well, frankly, I don't know. I think that we, going back to 2005, we probably believed, or the Bush administration believed, that the Anti-Secession Law was not helpful, and that it made the situation more tense. Now, I suspect that policymakers at that time would have also said that this only makes explicit what is already fairly clear about Beijing's policy, that if certain things happen in Taiwan, that China will have to use force. So the core of it is not something new. I mean, it gave it legal authority, and we know that China's a country bound by the rule of law, so it's a joke. But the good thing that happened after the Anti-Secession Law was that Hu Jintao then pretty quickly reached out to Mr. Lian Zhan, former Vice President Lian Zhan, and Lian Zhan went to Beijing, and the basis was laid for a re-engagement once the KMT came back to power. So China was operating along two fronts at the same time. Its usual two-handed policy. Tom Finger.
Thank you, Richard. I'd like to go back to your observation, correct one, in my view, that this is an election about domestic issues.
Yes.
That what must Tsai do early in her term to address the domestic concerns, the issues on which her party, the public, think she was elected, and do any of those link to Cross-Straits? An unfinished agenda in terms of economic dealings, or build momentum through successful domestic policies to then influence the way in which she's prepared to interact with the mainland? You see where I'm going.
Well, I think that there is an economic agenda for any Taiwan president, whether it's KMT or DPP or even something else. And and some of these Tsai is probably more likely to address than others. She's made a big point about the inequality in Taiwan society, and although inequality in Taiwan is probably not as severe as it is in some other places like Hong Kong, there may be ways to address that. You know, maybe sort of rebalancing of the tax system. There are some issues looming on the horizon that must be addressed. One has to do with pensions and the healthcare system, and making sure that those are both sort of well-funded for the long term, because Taiwan has an aging society almost as severe as Japan's, and if those aren't well-funded, it could sort of place a very large burden on young people and affect economic growth and competitiveness. The other challenge that she faces is energy and ensuring enough energy supply for future growth. And in this, she's handicapped by her own party's longstanding position of being against nuclear power, and how Taiwan can provide the energy resources that producers need without nuclear power, and, by the way, do the right thing on fossil fuel emissions is something that I'm not smart enough to answer. I think there is an important outstanding issue about trade liberalization, which Taiwan needs to stimulate structural adjustment of the economy and set the path for larger growth, for broader growth. The immediate task would be to pass the bill that's been sitting in the Legislative Yuan concerning supervision of negotiations of trade agreements. This goes back to the service trade agreement between the two sides of the strait, which led to the Sunflower Movement, and I think that will be worked on, and so it then is a signal to Beijing that Taiwan has made adjustments that, under the right political circumstances, could lead to further trade agreements. Taiwan needs to liberalize not just with the mainland, but with other major trading partners, but that in turn requires certain confidence on Beijing's part that doing that is not part of a Taiwan independence agenda. And it was frankly quite grudging in allowing Taiwan to conclude free trade agreements with Singapore and New Zealand. The big prize, which both President Ma and President-elect Tsai have both identified, is Trans-Pacific Partnership. That is a pretty steep hill to climb, but it's probably worth shooting for. So a lot of things that have to be done. I think education is also a big question, and making sure that the education system is producing the sorts of people that the economy needs to sort of support the sort of economic strategy that Taiwan in its position has to pursue.